Welcome everybody to the 8th installation of MarshWatch. This is going to be our last ID session. I can't believe we're already at this point. Before we get started, I'd just like to say that I'm joining you today from Saskatoon. We're located on Treaty 6 territory, which encompasses the traditional homelands of the Cree, Dakota, oh goodness, I'm stumbling through it today. The traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis. I, of course, am your host, Leanne Lechermoy, and I have the pleasure of working for an organization called Birds Canada. We're a natural history-based not-for-profit. Man, this isn't going so smoothly this week, is it? Anyway, we're an organization with a mission to drive action to increase understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds in Canada, including their habitats. And this is me proving my love of wetlands. Sometimes you'll find me in those kind of strange places listening and looking for birds. Okay, on our agenda for this evening, I've got some marsh walks to let you guys know about. I haven't hammered out all the details yet, but I do have dates set for several of them. We're going to go through some bird and amphibian ID, and then on the back end, we're going to talk a little bit about data collection 101, and then afterwards, we're going to do the quizzes and discussion as usual. So might be a little bit longer one today, but I am happy to share that we're going to be in a bunch of different places. So we're going to be going to Regina on Sunday, June 9th. I'm doing a walk in Saskatoon Saturday, June 15th. I'll be in Prince Albert Sunday, June 16th. In Brandon, Saturday, June 22nd. Then in Winnipeg, Sunday, June 23rd. And we'll do a Blaine Lake trip on Sunday, July 7th as well. So details are going to come on the MarshWatch page. I think the only one that I have all the details hammered out so far is the walk in Brandon. I have an idea for everything I'm going to do in Regina and Saskatoon, and Regina will be at the conservation area of Wascana Park, and in Saskatoon, we're going to go to, oh, what's the park's name? Not Donna Berkmeyer, but it's one of those ones in that area. Anyway, check the website. It'll be more reliable than my brain apparently is today. So I'll be posting those mostly next week as I finish getting all of the details sorted out. But I can't wait to meet some of you in person, and hopefully you can join. The walks are open to anyone. The only one that might have a fee associated with it is the one in Winnipeg. I've been having a hard time coming up with a really good wetland place to go that is within the city of Winnipeg. I didn't want to, make people drive too far for it or anything. So it might be at Fort White Alive, which does have an entry fee, but I'm going to get in touch with them and maybe see if we can't work something out. But details to come. I'm really looking forward to it. It's going to be a blast. I love wetlands, and you'll get to, hang out with me in person and bring your friends. It's a nice time. Okay, we're going to be covering quite a few species today. We've got 2 rails, Virginia and yellow. We've got 2 sparrows, LeContes and Nelsons. We've got 2 grebes, Western and Clark's. We've got the blackbird, which is the bobolink, and we've got a larger wading bird, the white-faced ibis. We're also going to be covering 2 kind of fossorial cryptic little toads that are, in the grassland and dry areas. These guys live a fair bit of their time underground, and so they come out when it's wet, and mostly you identify them by hearing them because often they're nocturnal and only coming out when it's, the right conditions. Okay, let's get started. I'm seeing a few things in the chat, so I'll take a look at those at the end, but I'm excited that people are going to be throwing out some suggestions. Okay. First off, we've got the ever handsome Virginia rail. So as we talked about on the preamble here, rails are oftentimes quite secretive, and they're actually laterally compressed. This bird looks quite wide, but I assure you, if you look at it from head on, it's quite narrow, and it's built that way so that it can really easily wiggle its way through, really dense stands of vegetation in a wetland habitat. Virginia rails are really handsome. Both sexes look the same. They've got that kind of drooping, longish bill for a rail, and it's this beautiful red color. Their faces have this gray patch on them, and then the rest of their body is kind of warm tones with streaks of black, and their flanks and rear end are this really nice black and white streaking. So it's quite a handsome bird. It is really tough to get a look at. They're not super abundant when you compare it to something like the Sora. There's Soras all over the place. They call, if you slam your car door. Virginia rails are not quite that. They're definitely much more secretive. Their calls don't travel quite as well, so it's hard to hear them from, say, like across the wetland. You'll hear the Sora, no problem. But it's going to be tougher to hear that Virginia rail at a distance. So, you know, you're going to have a harder time seeing them. And they're really active like at night and first thing in the morning. Their activity, their calling levels drop off during the daytime. So rather secretive birds. So one that it's really worthwhile to learn the calls for. And I'll play you that here. We've got two of their primary calls. One of them is called the ticket call, and it really just goes ticket, 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 ticket. Play that now. Play it once more. It's almost got a frog chirping like quality to it. So a little ticket, 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 ticket. And another one they do is the grunt, and they can actually get going as a pair, and you get one starting the grunt, and the other pair mate or a member of the pair will join in to do this kind of duetting grunt sound. And it really kind of sounds like, to me, like a pig like oinking in the wetland. It's kind of funny. So really neat little calls. And again, some of these that don't carry super well, you got to be there pretty early in the morning. Or, if you are really that keen about wetlands and, you've got a safe one to go check them out at night. They're really fascinating places because, unlike, say, the forest or something, wetlands really come alive at night. There's all kinds of birds that call, throughout the night and throughout the day as well. So do check them out at nighttime. They're a ton of fun. What do these guys eat? Well, they eat all kinds of things: snails, slugs, insects, spiders, earthworms. They'll even go for seeds of aquatic plants and stuff, but usually they're going for some kind of protein material. So all kinds of things that they can pick and grab. And they'll walk around, they'll probe in the muck a little bit, and they'll also peck at the surface of the ground or the water, or if there happens to be something climbing up the side of a plant stem, they'll grab that too. So they're kind of those walking, probing, and pecking little birds. They kind of walk around like a little chicken in the wetland. They've got a wide distribution across North America, and you'll see them, in a fair bit of southern Canada as well. They don't really like the Rockies. It's a bit tough for them there, at least in Canada. But overall, it's a widespread bird. It's not super super common, but definitely widespread. Okay. The most secretive rail that we have here in Canada is the yellow rail. There is an even more secretive one if you get further south, the black rail, but the yellow rail is right up there with terms of, very secretive. It's a small, tiny little bird. It's very compact. It's got a short yellow bill. Both sexes look alike, and they're primarily just kind of streaked browns and, tan colors, a little bit of that sandy color with this nice kind of dark stripe through the eye. I'm telling you this, but you're not likely to see them. One of the more helpful things is sometimes if they flush, if you're walking through an area, you will see a small little marsh bird pop up that's got kind of short, rounded wings. And I'm actually amazed someone managed to get a photo of this. But they've got this nice little white wing patch here, and otherwise they look kind of nondescript and like the small blur. They don't fly a terrible distance away before they drop back into the wetland vegetation because they really prefer to walk and go through all of that tangled grassy stuff. They're a specialist of this kind of shallow, sedgy, grassy wetlands. So especially on the prairies, when we go through a wet cycle, a lot of wetlands kind of overflow their borders, and there's water in all of these little grassy areas. And if it stays for long enough, it becomes really good yellow rail habitat. So they're a little bit boom and bust, and their habitat preferences, they're so ephemeral that they don't often return to the same locations. And we know that because the reason that I started working here in Saskatchewan is that I was hired on to help do marsh bird surveys, and we also were trapping yellow rails in our study site, and where they were year to year changed depending on the water conditions. And we banded them for 5 years, and we only ever caught one bird between years. It was pretty amazing. I think we got 52 in total, and most of the time never saw the birds again. They move around the wetland vegetation. They eat primarily small snails. It's kind of the most important. So if you're going through a sedgy area and you see all kinds of teeny tiny snails on the vegetation, that's really what they're after. They love those little snails. They'll also, of course, eat aquatic insects, terrestrial insects, and seeds as well. And you are very unlikely to, get a glimpse of this. It's one of those lifer birds that people will chase because it's, or, they'll go and they'll stake out wetlands at night. And it's really, really tough to even get a chance to hear this bird, let alone see it. The sound is really interesting, and it honestly sounds like if you took two rocks and you started tapping the rocks together in a rhythmic tick, 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 tick. And they do this on repeat when they're really going for it. And if you get a lot in an area, it can actually start to just sound like popcorn because all of those calls are overlapping. So I'll play you their tick 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 song. It's kind of out there in terms of bird songs. It's very different, and it really does sound like if you were tapping two stones together for a tick 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 tick. So that is the handy little yellow rail. And I've actually got a little video to show you because we did video them on occasion after banding them, and to show you just how much these guys prefer walking over flying, I'm going to show you a bird. This is just after we'd, taken some measurements of it and put a little band on it. And, it just kind of shakes it off and walks into the grass. So here he goes. And they just go around like a little, swamp chicken moving around saying, ugh, what were these people doing? And the hilarious thing about these guys is that, and during the breeding season, they're so amped up. We've actually had them do that tick, tick, tick call while we were, holding them to band them. And sometimes they'll walk off a few meters away into the grasses and they'll start calling again. Because how we trapped them was we would play their call and we would stand there with some big, essentially, fish landing nets to, put over them as they scurry out into the little opening that we've created. And they're really just amped up and they're trying to find that big, mean yellow rail that's in their territory. It's amazing how feisty these little guys are. So cute little bird. They got a pretty broad distribution, but it's ephemeral. They're not always going to be, across the landscape because their habitat is so specific, and it changes, year to year depending on the moisture regimes. That you take the range map with a grain of salt. You're not likely to see them in a lot of the shield country unless you got a really nice large, sedgy fen that you happen to come across. So anywho, that is the yellow rail. Next up, I've got two similar looking sparrows, and they are so similar, in fact, that we're going to start off just listening to them because they are both kind of secretive, the LeContes and the Nelsons. And even if you do get a look at them, the details between the two species are often so subtle that it is tough to tell them apart, even if you've got, a look at them. If you get a really great look, it's easy to tell them apart, but that's often not how we see a lot of these birds. So the song is definitely the way to go. So the LeConte sparrow has an insect-like song, and it goes ticka-ch, ticka-ch. I'll play that now. So it's really got that kind of insect-like quality to it. The Nelson sparrow, it really kind of sounds like throwing bacon into a hot pan. It's got a very sizzly quality. It's also very ephemeral. You know, it doesn't travel very far. So we'll listen to the bacon sizzle of the Nelson sparrow, or sometimes I like to think that it says tequila. You do whatever works for you. See if you can hear either of those. So it's very kind of ephemeral. It has a sizzly quality to it, whereas the LeConte sparrow does that ticka-ch, ticka-ch. Sounds much more like an insect. I'll get that tequila going for you again. All right, so those are the two similar sparrows. Let's take a look and see what they, look like visually. Maybe you happen to get a great photo like Nick got of these sparrows. So LeConte's on the left, Nelson's on the right. The things that distinguish these, the two kind of easiest things to lock on are the crown stripe, so that kind of median crown stripe, the one that goes right down the middle of the head. It's straw colored on the LeConte's, and it's kind of this slate gray blue on the Nelson sparrow. And next we're going to take a look at the nape of the neck. So it's kind of right, at the back of the neck, if you would imagine it on the bird. And on the LeConte's, it's kind of got these purplish brownish streaks over kind of a light gray background. And the Nelson's has a, similar to that crown stripe, it's got this kind of grayish stripe. But, if you were to surmise, you're seeing these two little birds at a distance, they're hard to tell apart. Overall, they definitely look like sparrows, and they're in a group of sparrows called the Amadramus sparrows. That's the genus. They tend to have a bit of a flattened head compared to other sparrows. But these guys at a distance, they both really look very orangey overall. The Nelson sparrow more so, you can see it's got that kind of orange wash in the face, a little bit on the breast. The LeConte's at a distance kind of evokes that same, warm orangey tones, though it's not as rich. But, it is tough. And I can honestly tell you that I've identified these, by sight probably only once ever, in part because they're usually singing, especially the LeConte sparrow sings a fair bit. The Nelson's is a bit less common, and, it doesn't sing quite as loudly, so it's easy to miss it if you're not paying attention, or if you just happen to be far enough away from the bird, they're easier to miss. So yeah, overall, orange-toned sparrows, these are both going to be found in wetland habitats. They both got this nice little grayish cheek patch. It's darker on the Nelsons, lighter on the LeContes, but really the two keys, if you're, say, looking at pictures and you want to know what they are, that median crown stripe right down the center of the head is straw-colored on LeContes and grayish on the Nelsons, and the back of the nape is striped on the LeContes, and it is plain on the Nelsons. And, for the longest time, I couldn't keep those straight in my head, but at least I knew which keys to look for. I knew to look for the central stripe and to see what the back of the neck was doing, and then I would go to my guide and go, aha, yes, it was the LeConte sparrow, because for whatever reason, sometimes, your brain doesn't always, make that distinction, but I knew which, parts to look at. So if you can just remember which parts to look at these brown, marshy sparrows, then, you're on your way to doing a great job. The habitat types are slightly different between the two, but there is a fair bit of overlap. The LeConte likes open habitat with kind of marshy meadows, slightly drier than the Nelsons, kind of moist soil areas. And they also eat like seeds and insects and arthropods. Both of them do that. The Nelsons is going to be found more in those sedgy wetlands. So in the same places where you have yellow rails, you usually have Nelson sparrow as well. They're both queuing in on that habitat for different reasons. The Nelson's not maybe going to eat all of those large snails, but, it does like that shallow wetland that has kind of grassy and sedgy components to it. You're not going to find it in the deeper cattail wetlands. You'll always find these guys on the outside margins, if those outside margins still exist, because a lot of times those get plowed under, and they're one of the wetland habitats that, we increasingly have very little of because they're so easily, converted to, croppable acres. So LeConte's and Nelson's sparrows are two really handsome little kind of moist soil wetland sparrows. I've seen Nelson's the odd time too in, like a really wet ditch. Maybe there's a bit of a natural seep there that kind of always makes the grass grow really green and lush and keeps the soil moist. I've seen them in those contexts too. So they really do like that kind of moist soil, wettish, grassy habitat. And we can play their songs again for you. The tick-a-ch, more insect-like of the LeConte sparrow. And the more kind of ephemeral, bacon sizzly, tequila sounding of the Nelson sparrow. And they really do take these gaps like this in their singing. They don't constantly go. Usually the first time one calls, I go, hey, was that a Nelson sparrow? And then I have to wait a little bit for it to call again so that I'm paying attention in the direction that I'm hearing the song. So LeConte sparrow, tick-a-ch, and a more ephemeral, bacon sizzly call for their song for the Nelson's sparrow. LeConte has a pretty, prairie provinces distribution with a few pockets of them in other places. And the Nelson sparrow also has that central distribution, but you can also find them along the Hudson Bay and James Bay lowlands and on the kind of eastern seaboard maritime areas of Canada as well. So those are our two similar looking, sort of similar sounding sparrows. Next up, we've got two grebe species. We'll be talking mostly about the western grebe because a lot of this applies to the Clark's grebe as well, but we'll first describe the western grebe, which is definitely the much more common of the two. So western grebe is a pretty large grebe, especially when you compare it to the other smaller grebes that we've looked at, like the horned, eared, and piebilled. Those guys are all fairly small-ish. The western is, a decent-sized bird. It's got a very long, very graceful neck. It's got a long, ever so slightly kind of pointed bill. It's just a really elegant, dainty looking largish bird. Both sexes look the same. They're black and white overall with a white belly, neck, and cheek. And the black in the western grebe extends below the eye. So they got this nice dark cap that kind of flows into this, black on the back and back of the neck. But for the western grebe, it's going to be encompassing that nice, lovely red eye. That's good to pay attention to because in the Clark's grebe, the black doesn't extend around the eye, and you can actually, see the eye a little bit more clearly because it's bordered in white. This is a bird that nests on large, very large wetlands or lakes, and they make their nests in colonies in stands of emergent vegetation. So, big stands of cattail, big stands of bulrush, and, they'll often be cruising quite large bodies of water. And they have an interesting call, and it sounds like one of those rusty gates. It just sounds like a creaking gate. They really do a creak creak, and it can travel a fair distance. They have that benefit of being a fairly large bird, and they often choose large bodies of water, and sound travels really well over water. So listen to the western grebe call, the creak creak. So it really does kind of sound like, a gate that's got a really squeaky, rusty hinge on it. We'll come back to the call in a little bit here. The western grebe, like all the other grebes, is one of those expert divers. If you'll recall from the other grebe discussions, they've got their legs really far back on their bodies, which makes them really excellent at swimming and propelling underwater, but it makes them horribly awkward on land. And so they really only, clamber up onto their nest in terms of being on land. Otherwise, they're quite an aquatic bird. But they can, use those hind legs to really get up in the water because much like all the other grebes, they do elaborate, courtship and mating rituals. And in the, on the right hand side here, we can see two grebes, doing one of, I think that's probably the weed ceremony, where they collect nesting material like weeds and plant matter, and then they both present it to each other. They go up on their back legs, and usually they'll bump their chests together, and it's just a really cute thing to watch. If you ever have the chance to go see a Western grebe colony and just sit back and watch in the early season, they're really quite something to see. So they do eat a lot of fish, and they'll occasionally take other prey. And as we've mentioned before, grebes will also pluck their own body feathers and feed them to their young. They'll eat them themselves as well. And this is thought to, create a little plug in their stomach so that their acids have a better chance at digesting all of those fish bones. That's just speculation, though. It's hard to ask them exactly why they do what they do, but that's the leading theory, is that they're, collecting feathers in their stomach so that the contents move less quickly through it and can dissolve a little bit better. So here at the bottom we can see this nice adult plucking off a body feather and feeding it to its young. So pretty cute little behaviors. Western grebes are quite western indeed. So if you live in eastern Canada, you'll have to come out west to visit these little birds, but they have pretty wide distribution. Again, they're you'll find them on big bodies of water, so usually big lakes or very large wetlands. Clark's grebe, on the other hand, is very, very similar to the Western grebe, but you'll notice it looks a lot brighter. That's because it's got a fair bit more white on the face. So I usually remember it as Clark's, you can see the face. So see for Clark, and seeing the face a little bit more, seeing the eye. They don't have that dark that goes on the bottom. You can see the two compared down here. The Western, that dark coloration on the head, scoops down well below the eye, so you can't really, the eye doesn't stand out, especially at a distance. But on the Clark's grebe, the black, stays above the eye along the head, and you can see the eye a little bit better. That's my trick for telling them apart. Their bills are also slightly differently colored. The Clark's grebe has a much more plain yellow and bright yellow bill. It's a bit more dull and drab on the Western grebe. So if you have them in the same location, it can be really nice to see. I've only ever seen a handful of Clark's grebe. Their range overlaps quite extensively with the Western grebe, but they're far less numerous than the Western. So if you're lucky, you might get to see yourself a Clark's grebe. I think the only ones I've seen have been at the Quill Lakes, or Quill Lake singular, since it's mostly one body of water now. So still black and white overall, white belly, white neck, white cheek, and otherwise black. So very, very handsome little bird. Same habitat requirements, big lakes, big wetlands, nesting in vegetation. And their call is slightly different. They don't have that 2-syllable creak creak. They just do a longer creak, or 1-syllable creak themselves. So here's the creak of the Clark's grebe. And if you remember anything about what the Western grebe's range looked like, this is almost identical to it. So very, very broad range overlap between the two species, but Clark's grebe is, far, far less numerous than the Western grebe. Oh, and I don't have a comparison slide side by side. I should have. Okay. Moving on, we have our final blackbird. This is the bobolink. It's a medium-sized blackbird, maybe a little bit smaller than the red-winged and yellow-headed vireo. Oh goodness, yellow-headed blackbird. It's got a long conical bill, and the males are black overall with a white back and rump and wing patches, and they have this really lovely, very, very obvious straw-colored patch on the back of their heads, kind of like a little skull cap. So their wing feathers are edged in straw, and especially when they're displaying, if you see them from behind, they'll puff up their feathers and really, puff all of those white feathers up to really, get a nice display going. You'll find bobolinks in moist grassy fields. That includes irrigated hay fields and the natural grassy wetland edges. So if you have, a naturally occurring wetland and it's got all of these, upland habitats around it that kind of gently bleed into, grassy areas and more upland areas, you'll find the bobolink in places like that. And one of my favorite things about this bird is its song. It really does sing like R2-D2. It sounds like it's making all of these robot noises, and the birds have a tendency to, fly and display while they're doing this. So they make themselves quite obvious. So here is the song, and I'm hoping you'll love it if you've never heard it before. And if you've heard it before, that you'll love it still. So I think that's just fabulous. There's really nothing else that's going to sound quite like, an R2-D2 robotic critter, out in grassy areas. So I'll play it once more just because it is so wonderful. So pretty remarkable song. The females, on the other hand, look absolutely nothing like the males, other than, of course, their size and shape. So still medium size, we still got that long conical bill. It's pink in the females, and the females tend to have this really leggy appearance. They're overall really kind of yellowy straw colored, and they have a nice little dark eye line with a dark cap and a white, kind of straw colored patch along the median crown stripe, and otherwise are really quite brown and streaky. One thing you might notice is that the bobolinks have really extra long little, toenails, which are quite remarkable if you're seeing the bird in hand or if you get a really good picture of them on a fence or anything. So very handsome little birds, but they are a lot more kind of reserved. They don't, go out in the open quite as much as the male. So I think you're less likely to run across the female bobolink than, say, something like the male. The males are really going to make themselves obvious and showy, and they'll be displaying. And sometimes you can get, a few males in an area trying to, one up each other, and they'll, fly around and display and be singing like crazy. So this is the female bobolink. She's definitely much more drab and very, very kind of plain and straw colored. These guys eat all kinds of stuff. So they'll eat seeds, insects and their larvae, spiders, snails. They do like that kind of moist meadow habitat. So, there's all kinds of critters that are attracted to that. Here's a zooming in on the map here for North America. So lots of places in southern Canada and the northern US that you're likely to see these guys on the breeding grounds. Okay, and last but not least, our last bird is the white-faced ibis. It's a medium-large wading bird. It's got a nice long neck and a very long, exaggerated, decurved bill. Both the sexes look alike, and they're kind of this maroonish, deep brown overall, and they have this shiny iridescence kind of on their wings and back. They're really quite beautiful and quite striking if you get them in the right light. I've seen photos of them where they're just kind of they almost look technicolor as they're in flight and the light is hitting them just right. They have long red legs and they have white feathers surrounding red facial skin. So these are the adults in kind of their breeding plumage. There is a little bit of variation. There's some adults that are a little bit duller. So you can see in this bottom photo here, this adult has quite a bit of white, whereas the one on the top has a little bit more reduced white. Um, Adult birds are going to have this lovely red eye, and juveniles, and we'll talk about them, we normally don't, but white-faced ibis tend to wander after, they've fledged. They'll disperse a great distance. So those ones definitely have a much darker iris, but talk about that again in a second. Their habitat is kind of these shallow, large wetlands. And if you're anywhere near Franks Lake in Alberta, I suggest you go check it out. I haven't been myself, but I always see fantastic photos of all kinds of ibis and neat water birds there. They nest in emergent vegetation or low trees and shrubs over water. And I've included their call. It's not really something that I think is the most critical. The sound that they make will alert you to them if you haven't already seen them, but they make these kind of guttural honking noises. Oh, and I probably didn't share my sound. Hang on just one second. New share. Screen one, share sound. Okay, so I will play the guttural honks for you. Those kind of, it's not really a very, descript sound. It's not something that you would, routinely identify by sound alone. The white-faced ibis is something you're going to be, much more likely to see and identify by sight. So I've got a few individuals here. I've got a first summer bird, and the first summer birds, they don't quite look as magnificent as the full-fledged adults. They don't really have that maroon coloring. Instead, they've got this kind of striped appearance to their head, but by their first summer, they've acquired that lovely red eye, and their facial skin is starting to take on those reddish tones. Young of the year, as you can see in this photo down below, they're really much darker, much more nondescript. They don't really have any of that pale markings around the base of the bill. Their eye is dark, and their facial skin is also dark. So they're just overall pretty drab. But I bring this up because they really do wander a fair bit post-fledging. So they'll just kind of explore and see if they can't find new territory that's suitable. Maybe they'll come back the next year. And what's interesting about the white-faced ibis, we'll see in a second here, is that they have expanded a fair bit recently. They're a really unique bird in flight. They've got that kind of bill that curves quite a bit. They'll hold their head up, and they've got their legs just kind of trailing out behind them. So they're pretty obvious if you see this big dark bird flying that's got this incredibly hooked bill and it's got its legs trailing behind them. It's pretty obvious. Their diet, they're kind of probing and pecking stuff off of the muck, and I've seen them in upland habitats too, kind of grabbing some insects. So they'll eat aquatic and moist soil insects, crustaceans, as well as earthworms. So quite a neat bird that we're seeing more and more here in Saskatchewan. And I know in Alberta it's been a while that they've been kind of more established. So here's what the range map looks like on Cornell's Birds of the World. There is a population in South America, but the one here in North America, if you look at the range maps, looks fairly limited. And you're going, gosh, why are we talking about this in a prairie, wetland program? Well, let me show you. Because of this, they are, increasingly being reported, especially in Alberta, that for whatever reason, it seems like they broke into Alberta first, and they're kind of making their way west a little bit, and they're coming up from the southern United States into a few spots here in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So there's a chance that you might see some. I actually saw a group of, I think, about 80 by the border of Alberta. It's kind of right in here. It was an incredible amount. I saw one or two and I got excited about that. And then I drove a little further over the hill and there was just, at least 80 birds. It was kind of incredible. So these guys are, expanding their range, expanding their territory, and yeah, it's neat to see them here on the Great Plains. Okay, on to our cryptic and fossorial toads. The first up is the plains spadefoot. It's a relatively small toad, 1.5 to 2.5 inches, got really comically large eyes. And to me, that's the thing that really stands out. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting one of these little critters face to face, but from every picture I looked at, they just had these incredibly, cartoonishly large eyes. Their bodies are quite variable in terms of coloration. They can be, anywhere from tan to brown. They usually have tiny little orange spots. And some of them have stripes, but not all of them have these kind of stripes. So if you were to zoom in on this image, there's teeny tiny little orange spots on them. They have short little legs, and those are made primarily for just like rooting around and digging in the soil. So the adults are primarily fossorial, meaning they spend most of their time, in and underground, and they'll emerge in warm, wet periods. So it's got to be, the right conditions for these guys to come out. They're pretty nocturnal and they're pretty secretive, and they make a really funny sounding call, and it kind of goes like whir, whir. So weird little whirring call. This is one that I haven't ever heard or seen yet. I'm hoping I'm going to go do some grassland bird surveys in southern Saskatchewan through parts of the summer. So fingers crossed, I'm hoping to run into some plains spadefoot because I think that would just be so neat. So I'll play the whirring again for you. All right, that is the plains spadefoot. The other kind of cryptic fossorial toad is the Great Plains toad. It's a little bit larger, 2 inches to 2.5, 2 inches to 4.5 inches. Much more variable in terms of body color, can be anything from gray to brown to green, and it has much more kind of dark blotchy spots to it and lots of little warts all over it. It too has short little legs, and those are really excellent for, digging. So the adults are fossorial when inactive, so they'll just be hanging out in the soil underground somewhere, enjoying life when they're not, out and trying to attract a mate. You'll find them in areas such as deserts, grasslands, semi-desert shrublands, open floodplains, and agricultural areas. And they have this kind of loud, sort of mechanical trill, but it really reminds me of someone, doing this, going. I don't think there's a name for that movement, but making a noise and running your finger over your lips with a hum. It's a really interesting call. And this one I have heard. They're only in a few locations in Canada, but I have at least heard the Great Plains toad, so I'll play it for you now. It's really quite incredible. So it's really quite loud, really quite long, and especially if you have, a bunch of them calling, it's quite impressive, and it just seems like it goes on forever. So that is the Great Plains toad. Cute little guy. I would love to see one day because, those fossorial toads, they just look so cute and chubby. All right. Let's go over some of the bird sounds that we've covered today. We've got the Virginia rail doing the ticket, 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 and the grunt. So here's the ticket. And the grunt that they'll often do in a kind of paired duet sounds a bit like a pig in the marsh. And the yellow rail, that, rhythmic tick, 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 that really sounds like two stones tapping together. Just seems amazing to me that a bird could make a sound like that. Our two similar looking, fairly orangey sparrows, the LeContes and the Nelsons. The LeConte sounds more like a tick, more like an insect. And the Nelson sparrow, much more sizzly, crispy, ephemeral, sort of sounds like it's saying tequila. So very, very quiet and ephemeral. Definitely best identified with sound. We have our two grebes, the western grebe doing that two-syllabled creak, creak. And the Clark's grebe, just a singular creak, no two syllables about it. And the bobolink with those little R2-D2 noises. And I didn't include the ibis and the bird sounds because it really isn't very distinct and not something that you would really be focusing on for that species. Our two toad sounds, the whir, whir of the plains spadefoot. And the Great Plains toad, that kind of loud, long, strange sounding trill. It almost has a vibrating quality to it. One that truly goes on for quite a long time. Phew, that wraps up our species, which kind of brings us to a natural point to talk about collecting checklists. We do have our own app. It's called the Nature Counts, but much like our data entry system for Birds Canada in general, Nature Counts has an app, and MarshWatch actually has a protocol on the app. So if you want to collect information about wetlands that you visit, especially amphibians are really good to have. They don't get tracked in a lot of places terribly well. You can't put them into eBird or anything, and you don't always have a recorder or a picture of them to put them on something like iNaturalist. But if you want to collect MarshWatch checklists, you are more than welcome to. These can be from any wetland you like at any time. It's really a free and easy program if you want to, collect a little bit of information. We're going to be treating these checklists as, we know people have gone through the training program and they're pretty familiar with their marsh birds. You might not know, all the other adjacent species, but you're pretty good with the suite of marsh birds that we cover. So kind of 4 steps to it. Register for MarshWatch on Nature Counts, get the app or print yourself off a data sheet. We have those on the website. Get out, observe creatures, and submit your observations. So you can do that through the app or through the Nature Counts website if you want to print off a data sheet. So if you want to register, you can go to the MarshWatch website, and there's a little green button that says Submit Observations on Nature Counts. If you are new to Birds Canada and you've never collected data with us before, if you have no account, you'll hit the Sign Up button. But if you already have an existing account, say you've participated in the Canadian Lakes Loon surveys, any of the breeding bird atlases, you will already have a Nature Counts account, and you can log into that. There's a little section here. If you have a Nature Counts login and wish to register for the project, please click here so you can enter in your credentials and you don't create a duplicate of yourself in the system. You can get the app. It's available on the Apple Store or on Google Play, or you can print and download the data sheet, which might be helpful because on one side, it's a data sheet. On the other side, I've got a little bit of reference material there. It doesn't cover everything, but it covers some of the mnemonics for some of the more cryptic marsh birds. And I also give, a verbal description of the drakes, so the male ducks, so that you have a little bit of a jumping off point. So if you want to download that or just check it out, you are more than welcome to. And, observe, go out, look, listen for birds, listen for amphibians, anywhere you want, any wetland, identify what you can, count or estimate individuals. You don't have to say, oh, I know there was specifically 41, red-winged blackbirds in this marsh. A reasonable estimate is fine. And then you can listen for amphibians, identify what you can, and estimate abundance with the call code. We'll go over the call code in a second here. And anytime you're, making any sort of observation and you want it to be useful, you need to document the whens and the wheres. So the start and end time, the date, and the location. That's all super easy to do on the app. And then you're going to, say whether or not this is a complete checklist. Are you confident in reporting all of the marsh birds that you could identify? Obviously, there's stuff that, a distant duck couldn't identify it. But if you're going, oh gosh, I really only know like 3 duck species well, and I'm not confident at anything else, you can still submit information that way and just say, you're not reporting all of the observations. It's an incomplete checklist that you don't feel super confident about. And we have ways of, still potentially using that data, even if you're not super confident and you left out a lot of birds. And that's the key. If you're not sure of what a bird is, just leave it out. And that's okay. Because I have to do that all the time. Sometimes there's a small bird that goes zoom across my field of vision, and I go, I have no idea what that was. Looked like a sparrow, but couldn't tell anything else about it. That's normal, and that would still be considered a complete checklist because, all the birds that are available to me, I'm having, a good time identifying them. But if you sat there looking at the sparrow for 10 minutes and still couldn't figure out what it was, consider that an incomplete checklist. Then you can submit your observations. You can submit them directly through the app. The checklist is saved if you have no service, or you can submit them later online on the website. So you can visit the MarshWatch main site and click Submit Observations on Nature Counts. The app looks like this. It's fairly straightforward. If you want to go and have a bit more of an in-depth look at that, on the MarshWatch homepage, there is a link to a video where I actually walk you through using the app. So I won't go through it now, but if you want to, give it a try and submit some checklists, then, we'd be greatly appreciative of that. I do get asked for some data sometimes. Just recently, a colleague who had retired from Environment and Climate Change Canada is working on, a field guide to the amphibians, and, he contacted me for any of the, amphibian records that we may have from all of our programming from all years. So this data does get used, and, at Birds Canada, we believe in open data, and we share, the information with people who request it for kind of, research and science purposes and all of that good stuff. So if you ever wonder, does this stuff go anywhere? Like, who's going to care if I report boreal chorus frog from a pond? This kind of stuff does get used from time to time. So, that all that data can be super useful if you feel like collecting it. I don't want to pressure anybody into doing it. If you already have your own ways, that's fine. But if you, want to get involved, feel free to do that. It's a great way to report the amphibians along with the birds. Just briefly, I'm going to touch on those amphibian call codes that go from call code 1, 2, and 3. In call code 1, there's space between the start of calls. Maybe there's a little bit of overlapping, but there isn't individuals of the same species starting their call at the same time. For the most part, you feel like you can count the individuals. You're like, oh, I know there's 3 boreal chorus frogs because, they're each kind of going at their own pace, but it's not too muddled. Call code 2 is, some simultaneous calling. So some individuals calling at the same time as one another. So you can assign this when there are a few males of the same species calling simultaneously. Oftentimes there's still breaks in the chorus. There's kind of still an ebb and a flow to it. And you feel like maybe you could estimate the number of individuals. And call code 3 is full chorus, wall of sound. The calls are constant, continuous, and overlapping. And you're just going, oh my goodness, that is a lot of frogs. That's call code 3. So I'm just going to give you a little brief look at what that looks like on a spectrogram. A spectrogram is a visualization of, birds or amphibian sounds. On the x-axis here we have time. On the y-axis this is frequency. So lower down, lower frequency, higher up, higher frequency. And I'll play what we're seeing here for you. So this is some boreal chorus frogs, and this is call code 1. You can see the different individual calls. None of them are really starting at the same time, and you feel like you could probably estimate the individuals. So I'll play the sound for you now. And if you're hearing the Wilson snipe in the background, it looks like that. It's those kind of dotted lines on the bottom for a Wilson snipe. Pretty neat. We look at spectrograms a lot when we're analyzing recordings of, the environment to get counts of birds. Call code 2, some simultaneous overlapping calls, but there's still some breaks in the chorus. And call code 3, where there's just lots of calls, full, constant overlapping. Wow, that one is really not nearly loud enough. Well, you'll just have to take my word for it. It is a constant blur of frog calls overlapping. So those are just an explanation of the call codes, and that gives us an idea of the size of the population that you're listening to without having to go try to count all of the frogs that are calling, because it's generally impossible, and you shouldn't go trying to do that. Here's just a quick example of the datasheet. On one side, it lists all of the likely species on the ones that we've covered, along with, information like, location, the observers, the date, the start time, comments about where you were. And on the back, there's all of this kind of quick reference material. So mnemonics for the cryptic marsh birds, a couple of silhouettes, key field marks for the drakes on the water, the male ducks, and at the bottom I've listed out, those amphibian call codes. So if you feel like taking part in that aspect of the project, definitely feel free to do that. And I just want to say thank you very much for attending this and bearing with my technical difficulties this evening. I'm just looking up, making sure everyone's still there every now and then. Um, Next week is going to be our big review session. So it's going to be a little bit longer than normal. So just in case, be prepared for that. We'll probably go, an extra half hour longer. I'm going to try to keep it, mostly to the point and, go through. I'm going to mark down which species you're more likely to identify visually, which ones are more, you're likely to identify by sound and all that good stuff. And we'll do lots of, comparative stuff. So thank you all for attending this webinar. I really appreciate it. If you want to reach out to me, I am skatlas@birdscanada.org. I think I saw earlier in the chat, if somebody has, a good recommendation for somewhere to go in Winnipeg or another place that you might want me to check out, let me know. You can visit us at birdscanada.org or find us on all the socials. We are a national not-for-profit, so if you enjoyed this webinar and you feel moved to make a donation and you're able to, we would greatly appreciate that. We would like to thank the MarshWatch supporters who, make programming like this possible. We've got the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, Sask Power, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. And of course, thank you to you guys. You guys make this all possible, and it's a ton of fun to deliver, especially when it goes smoothly.